Hey everyone, it's Harry, your host. Look, I need to show you something that happened yesterday that I genuinely think is one of the most important moments in modern geopolitics. And I'm not exaggerating. A standing ovation at Davos. When's the last time you saw that? When's the last time a world leader stood up there and said what everyone's been thinking but nobody had the guts to say? Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney just delivered what experts are calling the most consequential speech by a Canadian leader since 1947 yesterday at Davos. And here's what he said that made the entire room stand up and applaud. If you are not at the table, you are on the menu. But here's where it gets complicated. He wasn't just giving a motivational speech. He was declaring that the world order we've known for the past 80 years is dead, not dying, dead. He used the word rupture, a rupture in the world order. And then he said something that kept me up last night. The old order is not coming back. We should not mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy. Wait, it gets worse. He's talking about the rules-based international system. You know, the one we've all been told keeps the world stable. The UN, NATO, the WTO, all of it. He's saying it's finished. And not because it failed suddenly, because it was always partially a lie. His exact words. We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture because this wasn't just some philosophical speech about global politics. This was Canada announcing a complete strategic pivot away from the United States. And the timing, Trump had just threatened to take Greenland the hard way or the easy way literally hours before this speech. And then this happened. Carney stood there in front of world leaders and said Canada stands firmly with Denmark and Greenland. He invoked Article 5 of NATO. That's the mutual defense clause. That means an attack on one is an attack on all. He's basically saying try it and you'll have a problem. But that's not even the real story. The real story is what Canada has been doing for the past 9 months while we weren't paying attention. 12 trade and security deals, 4 continents, 6 months. They doubled their defense spending. They signed agreements with the EU, China, India, and something called the NB8. That's the Nordic and Baltic countries. Here's what nobody's talking about. Last week, Carney was in Beijing. First Canadian Prime Minister to visit China in 8 years. He struck a deal with Xi Jinping, electric vehicles, and agricultural products. And you know what Trump said about it? That's okay. That's what he should be doing. Think about that for a second. Canada just made a major trade deal with China, the country the US has been trying to decouple from, and Trump said it's fine. Does that sound like the response of someone who thinks they're in control? This is the part that kept me up last night because what Carney is describing isn't just Canada going its own way. He's describing a complete reorganization of global power. He's talking about middle powers, countries like Canada, like the Nordic nations, like Australia, banding together to create new structures because the old ones don't protect them anymore. Okay. So I need to explain what's actually happening here, because the surface-level story doesn't capture how significant this is. Let me take you through the timeline of what Canada has been doing since March 2025, when Carney became Prime Minister. Reports are coming in that Canada has fundamentally restructured its entire foreign policy in less than a year. We're talking about a country that has been essentially tied to the United States economically and militarily for over a century, suddenly diversifying at breakneck speed. The China deal from last week. Let me break down what's actually in it. Canada agreed to allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the country at a 6.1% tariff. That's down from the 100% tariff they had in place. In exchange, China is cutting its tariff on Canadian canola seed from 84% to 15%. They're also removing tariffs on lobster, crab, peas, and canola meal. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The latest information shows that this isn't just about trade. Carney called it a strategic partnership. He said China has been more predictable than the United States in recent months. Let that sink in. A democratic Western leader is saying the authoritarian government in Beijing is more predictable than Washington. But here's what you need to understand. This isn't about Canada suddenly becoming pro-China. Carney was very clear about that in his Davos speech. He talked about guardrails. He talked about protecting Canadian sovereignty from interference. He specifically mentioned alleged Chinese election interference as something they're watching for. What we're learning is that this is about something called values-based realism. That's a term he borrowed from the Finnish president. It means you stick to your principles, human rights, democracy, sovereignty, but you're pragmatic about who you work with. You take the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. And then this happened at Davos. Carney laid out what he's actually building. He's not just making bilateral deals. He's creating what he calls a web of connections. Multiple partnerships with multiple countries across multiple continents so that Canada isn't dependent on any single power. Documents reveal that since taking office, Carney has signed trade agreements with not just China, but also India. Mercosur, that's the South American trade bloc, and he's deepening ties with the European Union. Canada is now part of something called the EU SAFE program, which is about building joint military infrastructure. Wait, it gets worse or better depending on how you look at it. He's also working to build what he calls a bridge between the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the European Union. If that happens, you're talking about a trading bloc of 1.5 billion people without the United States. Now, what I'm about to show you is why the traditional American foreign policy establishment should be concerned, because Carney isn't just diversifying trade. He's building alternative security partnerships. The NB8, those Nordic and Baltic countries I mentioned, they're working with Canada on submarine production and military aircraft. Canada just made unprecedented investments in over-the-horizon radar, submarines, aircraft, and what Carney called boots on the ice in the Arctic. Here's what nobody's talking about. The Arctic is becoming the next major geopolitical flashpoint. Russia is militarizing it. China calls itself a near-Arctic state and wants access, and now Trump is talking about taking Greenland. Canada shares the Arctic with all of these powers. So what Carney is doing is building a coalition of Arctic and near-Arctic nations to secure that region. But that's not even the real story. The real story is the speech itself and what it represents. Because what Carney did at Davos wasn't just announced policy. He laid out a vision for how middle powers should operate in a world where the great powers, the US, China, Russia, are no longer playing by the rules. This is the part where I need you to really pay attention, because what I'm about to explain is a fundamental shift in how global power works, and most people are completely missing it. Sources are now confirming that what Carney outlined in Davos is essentially a playbook for middle powers to survive in what he's calling a brutal reality where great power geopolitics is unconstrained. Let me translate what that means. For the past 80 years, the story we've been told is that there's a rules-based international order. Countries follow international law. The strong don't just bully the weak because there are institutions, the UN, the International Court of Justice, the WTO, that mediate disputes. And sure, the system wasn't perfect, but it generally worked. Carney just said that was always a myth, and we all knew it was a myth, but we went along with it because it was useful. He compared it to something from the Czech writer Václav Havel about living under communism. Shopkeepers would put communist slogans in their windows, not because they believed them, but because it kept them safe. It was performance theater. And that's what middle powers have been doing with the rules-based order. Carney's exact words, "You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration." When integration becomes the source of your subordination, what does that mean in practice? It means when economic integration with a larger power, let's say, hypothetically, the United States stops being mutually beneficial and starts being a tool of coercion, you can't keep pretending the old system works. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Because what he's proposing isn't isolationism. It's not, we're closing our borders and going it alone. It's something he calls variable geometry. And this is brilliant if you think about it. Variable geometry means you create different coalitions for different purposes. You work with the EU on trade. You work with the Nordic-Baltic countries on Arctic security. You work with China on clean energy and agriculture. But you have strict guardrails about technology and security. You work with India on other things. You build multiple partnerships so no single relationship can be weaponized against you. Officials are now saying that this represents a fundamental reorganization of how Canada sees its place in the world. And here's the thing, they're not the only ones thinking this way. Carney specifically called out that many countries are drawing the same conclusions. They're all building strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy means you can feed yourself, fuel yourself, and defend yourself without being dependent on any great power. Because, as Carney said, a country that cannot feed itself, fuel itself, or defend itself has few options. When the rules no longer protect you, you must protect yourself. And then he dropped the line that got the standing ovation. If you are not at the table, you're on the menu. Think about what that means. When middle powers negotiate bilaterally with a great power, they're negotiating from weakness. They take what's offered. But when middle powers band together, when they negotiate as a bloc, suddenly they have leverage. They're at the table instead of being on the menu. This is the part that kept me up last night because I started thinking about what this means for the United States. For the past 80 years, America has been the H-Gyan, the superpower, the country that sets the rules. And that came with benefits. Other countries generally aligned with U.S. interests because it was in their interest to do so. But what Carney is describing is a world where middle powers no longer automatically align with the U.S., where they build their own structures, their own trade blocs, their own security arrangements, and they do it because they've concluded that American power is no longer reliable, that it might be used against them. He was very careful not to name Trump. He only mentioned American hygiene once, but everyone knew what he was talking about. When he talked about great powers using economic integration as weapons, everyone knew he meant tariffs. When he talked about threats to territorial integrity, everyone knew he meant Greenland. Here's what nobody's talking about. The timing of this speech. Trump is about to arrive at Davos. He speaks Wednesday. And Carney just laid out a vision for a world order that explicitly doesn't rely on American leadership. That's a direct challenge. That's saying we're building an alternative and you're not invited to lead it. All right, so now we need to talk about what this actually means going forward because this isn't just abstract geopolitics. This has real implications for everyone watching this. Let's start with the immediate question. What does this mean for U.S.-Canada relations? Because that's the elephant in the room, right? Canada's largest trading partner by far is still the United States. 67% of Canadian exports went to the U.S. as of October 2025, even with the tariffs. So when Carney talks about diversifying trade, he's not saying Canada is cutting ties with America. He can't. The economies are too integrated. What he's saying is that Canada is reducing its vulnerability to American economic coercion by building alternative markets. His stated goal is to increase exports to China by 50% by 2030. That doesn't mean reducing exports to the U.S. It means adding capacity elsewhere so that if America decides to weaponize trade, Canada has options. But here's what I find fascinating, the reaction from other countries. Reports are coming in that this speech resonated particularly strongly with European leaders. The EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen also spoke at Davos about standing up to American pressure over Greenland. French President Macron has been saying Europeans should choose respect over bullies. What we're learning is that there's a coalition forming. Not an anti-American coalition exactly, but a coalition of countries that have decided they can't rely on American leadership anymore, and they're building their own structures. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture because this isn't just about trade and security. This is about values. Carney made a point of saying that when middle powers criticize economic intimidation from one direction, but stay silent when it comes from another, they're being hypocritical. They're keeping the sign in the window. So what does that mean for the China relationship? It means Canada is going to work with China where their interests align. Trade, climate change, some technological cooperation, but they're going to call out human rights abuses. They're going to protect against security threats. They're going to maintain what Carney called guard rails. And then this happened. Someone asked Carney about whether this signals a fundamental shift in Canadian foreign policy, and a former diplomat said, This is the most significant shift since 1947 when Canada helped build the post-World War II international order. Think about that. We're not talking about a minor adjustment. We're talking about a pivot as significant as the one that happened after the Second World War. Wait, it gets worse because Trump is speaking at Davos tomorrow, Wednesday, and he's walking into a room where the Canadian Prime Minister just laid out a vision for a world that doesn't need American leadership. That's not a coincidence. That's a deliberate challenge. Here's what nobody's talking about. The CUSMA review is coming up this year. That's the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement. It's up for renegotiation. And normally, Canada would be walking into those negotiations from a position of weakness because they need access to the American market so badly. But now Canada has signed 12 new trade deals in 6 months. They've got partnerships with China, India, the EU, Mercosur. They're building this Trans-Pacific Partnership EU bridge. Suddenly, they're not negotiating from desperation anymore. They're negotiating from a position where they have options. Documents reveal that Canada is now actively working to create new institutions, not replacing the UN or NATO, but building new structures that work alongside them for middle powers, specifically things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership EU bridge, things like the critical minerals buyers clubs he mentioned in the speech. Here's what nobody's talking about: the fiscal capacity to do this. Canada has massive fiscal space compared to most developed countries. They have lower debt to GDP ratios. They have enormous natural resources, energy, critical minerals, agricultural products. They have a highly educated population. They have some of the world's largest pension funds with trillions in assets. In other words, Canada has the economic foundation to actually pull this off. They're not bluffing. They can afford to build strategic autonomy. They can afford to double defense spending. They can afford to make long-term investments in alternative trade relationships. But that's not even the real story. The real story is whether other middle powers follow this playbook. Because if they do, if countries like Australia, South Korea, the Nordic nations, parts of Europe start building this kind of variable geometry strategy, you're looking at a fundamental reorganization of global power. And then there's the Arctic question. This is the part that kept me up last night because what Trump said about Greenland isn't just about Greenland. It's about the Arctic. And the Arctic is becoming the most strategically important region on the planet. Climate change is opening up new shipping routes through the Arctic. There are massive oil and gas reserves up there, critical minerals, and it's the shortest route for missiles between Russia and North America. Whoever controls the Arctic has enormous strategic advantages. Russia has been militarizing the Arctic for years. They've reopened Soviet-era bases. They've got icebreakers, military installations, the whole thing. China is calling itself a near-Arctic state and wants access to those shipping routes and resources. And now the US is talking about taking Greenland. Sources are now confirming that this is why Carney is building those partnerships with the Nordic-Baltic countries, because they're all Arctic or near-Arctic nations. Norway, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, they all have Arctic territory or Arctic interests. And if they work together with Canada, they can collectively secure that region without relying on unpredictable American policy. The latest information shows that this is already happening to some extent. Other countries are watching what Canada is doing very carefully. Australia is reportedly looking at similar diversification strategies. South Korea has been quietly building ties with European nations. Even Japan is reconsidering its absolute dependence on American security guarantees. The question is whether this becomes a model or whether it stays a Canadian experiment. Now, here's the thing I keep coming back to. What does this mean for America? Because if you're in Washington right now, you have to be concerned about this. Not because Canada is becoming an adversary. They're not. But because the foundation of American power in the post-war era has been a network of alliances with middle powers who generally aligned with U.S. interests. If those middle powers start building their own structures, start diversifying away from dependence on American markets and American security guarantees, American influence diminishes not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily and potentially irreversibly. Officials are now saying that the real test will be the next 18 to 24 months. Will other countries follow Canada's lead? Will the EU successfully build its own defense capabilities independent of NATO? Will the Trans-Pacific Partnership EU bridge actually happen? Will China hold up its end of the bargain with Canada, or will this turn into another trade dispute? Because here's what I find most interesting about all of this. Carney isn't betting everything on one strategy. He's building redundancy, multiple partnerships, multiple trade relationships, multiple security arrangements. So if one fails, the others are still there. That's what he means by variable geometry. That's what strategic autonomy actually looks like in practice. You don't put all your eggs in one basket. You build a web of connections so resilient that no single point of failure can bring the whole thing down. Carney ended his speech by saying they're not waiting for the old order to be restored. They're building something new, something that reflects the world as it actually is, not as we wish it to be. So here's my question for you. Is this the beginning of a post-American world order? Or is this just Canada hedging its bets while America goes through a chaotic period? Because I genuinely don't know the answer to that. What do you think? Let me know in the comments.